So, Asha, is the United States Supreme Court going to make it impossible to prosecute Donald Trump?
It's complicated. I'm Asha Rangappa. I teach national security law at Yale University. I'm a former FBI special agent, and I'm a legal contributor for ABC News.
And I'm Renato Mariotti. I'm a former federal prosecutor, a practicing lawyer, and a legal analyst.
And we're here to help you understand topics that can't be boiled down into a soundbite or a tweet. So, Renato, you're so boring.
I know your views on this are way more interesting than mine. I watched you on ABC this week and this week with George Stephanopoulos. This is the end of American democracy. Am I right?
Yes. And, he did a great job kind of framing what's at stake. Just so our listeners know, I wanted the opening question for Renato to be, has the Supreme Court put us on a path to dictatorship? And he thought that was too dramatic.
It was a little much. I mean, one thing I will say, because
I would have answered it's complicated.
I understand.
Not necessarily.
But, a lot of our viewers have commented, not a lot, but some of our viewers have commented that they're troubled by the fact that I am blasé, perhaps, or whatever word you want to use.
Sad panda.
Yeah, I'm blasé about the inequities or unfairness that's built into the system. I will just say, if you're actually practicing law, at a high level for a long period of time, you can begin to realize that there's unfairness that is in the system, and there's an element of BS that can be baked into the system a little bit, and it's frustrating. But I feel like my job is to explain that. I mean, did you really expect that that Justice Alito was going to not be very sympathetic to whatever Donald Trump was?
Well, I was just about to say that, maybe you should talk to Justice Alito because he's suddenly gotten woke. He's very concerned about the systemic injustices in the criminal justice system when it comes to Trump. Not for anybody else, but only when it comes to Trump. He's very concerned about rogue prosecutors and law enforcement agents and the fact that, apparently due process checks break down completely when it involves Trump.
Yeah, I wish he had the same level of concern about my clients.
He was not very blasé about Trump.
Yeah, I will say there is an element of nonsense there because, like I said, my clients often are treated unfairly by prosecutors across the country, and no one seems to care other than me and them. I'm basically like, look, don't hate the player, hate the game. The process can be unfair. There's these elements to it that, give prosecutors all this unfettered authority. So I don't disagree with the critique, but of course, right. I mean, if anyone doesn't need protecting, it is the former president of the United States with legions of people who will, harass witnesses on demand. It's interesting. I mean, I do think that it's reasonable for the Supreme Court to be concerned about, prosecutors using the process of criminal prosecution to harass former presidents, right? Like you could imagine, prosecutors doing that to Obama or Biden or something. I guess my take on it, and I know you and I both had discussed Steve Vladek's opinion. I think we both respect him. He's been a guest here on our podcast. Basically really focusing in on how the Supreme Court was doing too much here, was like trying to create some sort of rule for the ages and making this case way more complicated than it needed to be.
Yeah, so exactly. So there's a conservative tenet of judicial construction, which is when you're faced with a legal question, you answer the question presented to you and the one before you on the facts. And if you can avoid making a big constitutional or sweeping, rule for the ages, really, you're supposed to avoid it. And the court does this. So it's interesting. I just taught last week the case about the military commissions that were created under Bush. And the question was whether Bush had the constitutional authority to create these military commissions. And in that case, the court basically says, look, there may be some world, and some contexts where there could be constitutional authority for the president to unilaterally create military commissions. But this isn't one of them. And they went to the facts of the case and they found limitations on it. And so, you can leave that question open. They have done that in the Fourth Amendment context. They have said, look, there may be instances where, the president can engage in electronic surveillance for national security. And, we're not going to basically opine right now on whether there is a national security exception to the Fourth Amendment. What we are saying is that in this context, in the domestic setting, there needs to be some ex ante judicial process. So they do this all the time. They don't necessarily circumscribe the president. And so they can leave for another day a situation where there is a truly vexatious prosecution that's being presented to a court, for something that really should not be prosecuted, right? The drone strike against Anwar al-Awlaki is the one that keeps getting mentioned on Fox News, and it was brought up by, I think, Alito, because he watches Fox News apparently. Seriously, I think he's a Fox News watcher, but that one, you can make the immunity claim in that context that, this went through executive branch process and it was held to, it's authorized by the AUMF or whatever it is, and distinguish it and kind of do this on a case by case basis and let some doctrine of immunity evolve over time. But as you said, the court seemed to feel that they need to create some rule, and it was as though they were studiously avoiding dealing with the actual facts of the case before them. Because on the actual facts of the case before them, I think it would have been very hard for them to find that these were official acts.
That's right. And so, there was a quote that got a lot of attention from Justice Gorsuch, where he said, we're looking to create a rule for the ages, right? And that is contrary. You use the term conservative. That's with a small c. I don't really think this MAGA stuff is what I've traditionally understood to be conservative. Conservative
with a small c in terms of not being activist. This is exactly what the conservatives object to with Roe versus Wade, that there was kind of, you're reading things in and you're finding stuff that's, not there, or answering, in other contexts, answering questions that haven't actually been presented.
Right. It's having a humble understanding of judicial authority and not going beyond the case at hand. There's a sense in the way that law is built through cases traditionally has been, it's one case at a time. You take one fact pattern in front of you, you make a decision. It obviously has implications. And then, when another case comes, then you have a whole new fact pattern in which there's a new set of justices potentially drawing wisdom from what the prior set of justices said about a related but not entirely identical case. And that's how we build the law. Obviously these cases hopefully are not going to be common, criminal cases against former presidents. But for whatever reason, the Supreme Court's concerned about it. I will say I'm going to make a maybe provocative view on it. Yes, I understand that people are concerned about the fact that we had some justices who were talking about a rule for the ages, some justices who were willing to potentially they were showing some sympathy towards Trump's position. But at the end of the day, what I think we're going to end up with here is a Supreme Court majority that says that the Trump prosecution doesn't fall within the four corners of whatever this immunity is, and is going to ultimately send this back down. Now, it's going to take time, but I don't really think that it's going to derail the Trump prosecution.
Okay, well, maybe let's get to that conclusion after we lay out what the possibilities are, because I think it's important to understand why there's a concern about delay beyond just the handing down of the opinion itself. So I listened to this argument. And, there were some greatest hits. SEAL Team 6, came in again, and the Trump lawyers doubled down. They said that not only could the president order SEAL Team 6 to murder his political rival and potentially not be held accountable, he could even order the military to undertake a coup against the government and not be held accountable. So there were, so here's what I would say was the essential contours of Trump's lawyer's case. It was, there is absolute immunity. I think they added in 4 official acts as opposed to just absolute immunity generally. But, you know, official acts, I'm assuming very expansively defined, unless the president has been impeached and removed for those acts first, which of course means that such immunity is not absolute. That contradiction was never addressed. Then they added in a new argument. I don't even think which was briefed, but it was this idea that statutes applied to the president have to have a clear statement from Congress that they intended it for it to apply to the president. And there's, I think Professor Larry Tribe said there's like 3 statutes that actually specify this. But so you can see the next contradiction here, which is, you know, there's the argument, well, you can only prosecute him after he's been impeached and removed. But after that, if the statute doesn't name him specifically, then you can't prosecute him anyway. Right. And then there was the question for these, you know, extreme hypothetical SEAL Team 6, the military coup of, you know, what checks would there be on a lawless president? And Trump's lawyer said, well, the check is that the military wouldn't follow the order. They just have to say no. And, you know, they know that if they follow the orders, that they will be prosecuted because it's illegal to follow an unlawful order. And it was really interesting because not a single justice pointed out that all the president would have to do is pardon the person for engaging in the illegal act. We have seen this movie before. And essentially then it's just a matter of like, does the person have enough moral conviction? And if that's the only barrier, then the president just needs to appoint people who don't have that moral conviction, right? You pardon them. And then, by the way, then we're back to square one because the pardon is an official act which cannot be prosecuted. So that was sort of I think it was, I think I've used this analogy before. Is this old horror movie from like the 80s called, I think it was called The Legacy, but I just remember the end scene, which is like, there's all this like, you know, murder and mayhem happening in this big mansion and the people are trying to escape, but no matter what road they take, they just keep coming back to the scary mansion. And that's that was basically Trump's lawyer's argument.
But, you know, I will say, I don't see those arguments going anywhere. I mean, the Supreme Court almost tipped its hand in the question presented, right? They determined what the question presented was going to be before them. Trump's lawyers were only arguing for this absolute immunity stuff. They could have just denied and just said the absolute immunity, you know, they're not taking up this absolute immunity argument. And they could have focused, by the way, on oral argument, just, hey, you don't have absolute immunity. This is an easy case, right? But they said in the question presented, they wanted to determine to what extent. It's like this rule for the ages thing. To what extent there is presidential immunity, which is not before them. But like, there's no question that I think that there's no way a majority of the Supreme Court are going to hold that like you can murder people, right? Okay,
that's fine, Renato. But there are still kind of there are still several degrees below that. There are several points between the spectrum of no immunity, you know, even limited to this case, to absolute immunity that can cause a lot of problems. And the first one is there was some discussion about whether there ought to be immunity for core Article 2 functions. So I just mentioned the pardon power, for example. So particular powers that are explicitly given to the president that are in the exclusive domain of Article 2. So the pardon power, appointments clause. I think you run into a little bit of trouble here because there is a power to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. And that can cover a lot of ground. That's actually something that Trump is claiming in this case, that he was trying to take care that the voting laws were executed. So, you know, I think you still run into some problems there, but it was ostensibly a more limited view.
I think that, by the way, with the pardon power, I mean, that's something that I do think could be a concern, right? There were serious allegations about a pardon selling scheme during the Trump White House. He, as far as we know, has not been implicated in that, and that hasn't resulted in charges. But that's the sort of thing where, I mean, perhaps there could be some hair splitting later. Well, it wasn't the act even the pardon; it was the selling, right? The corrupt selling of it. That would be the act. But nonetheless, there is some concern there. But I think to give a positive spin, because there's a lot of people don't, I'm often the sad panda. Justice Barrett at least seemed to understand, Amy Coney Barrett, that, almost everything in this indictment isn't touched by any of this, right? And she seemed like very intent on just letting this prosecution go forward.
Yeah, the women on the court were the only people who didn't seem completely insane. So, but on the pardon point, I think what you just mentioned is important because, again, they were kind of grappling with this like weird tautological problem in the Trump lawyers' arguments. So they were talking about bribery. Like, what if a president were selling pardons? Wouldn't that constitute bribery? And if I understood the argument, Trump's lawyers said, yes, that's bribery, and he could be prosecuted, and the criminal act would be the taking of money, but you couldn't introduce the pardon. I think it was something like that. And then Justice Roberts was like, well, how would you prove the bribery if you couldn't show that there was, an official act that was given in exchange? And so the Sauer just like kind of, I don't know how he got around that, but Roberts was kind of grappling with that problem, which, I think gets to a more nuanced issue of, are you actually charging the president for the conduct? Or are you using different things that were being done under, official cover as evidence of motive or to, prove some element of the crime? Which I think, this is, that could be some distinction that is made in the final decision. But as I mentioned before, there was like the core presidential powers, and then there was this whole discussion more expansively, and this is where I think things could get problematic, of where does the line fall between official conduct and private conduct? And this is where I think the concern is that there could be a delay, because what's going on in the civil cases against Trump is he also asserted immunity in the civil cases that have been filed against him by members of Congress, by members of the Capitol Police who are injured by the insurrection. And what the judge there in the DC Circuit has said is that as of the facts as alleged fall on the side of private conduct and there's no immunity, so it survives a motion to dismiss. In other words, we're not going to dismiss the whole case. However, we're going to engage in some fact-finding through discovery, and he can, develop the record and then assert this again as a motion for summary judgment before trial. And remember, in the civil context, there is direct precedent that bears on this. There is the Nixon versus Fitzgerald case that says that anything that falls within the outer perimeter of the president's official duties are immune from civil suit. But I think the fear is that if the court tries to create a similar type of rule in the criminal context, then what will happen is even after the opinion comes down, it will be remanded to the district court to engage in this fact-finding inquiry to determine what's official or what's in the outer perimeter and what's purely private.
I agree 100%. And that's why the question in the beginning, I like the framing that we ended up with, because I think this is where it's complicated. I think that either Barrett or the Chief Justice Roberts, are going to author this opinion, joined by the three liberal justices, or the three Democratic appointees, I should say. and we're going to have an opinion that is going to permit this prosecution to go forward, largely or fully go forward. But yes, it could be very well a timing issue here. Now, Judge Chutkan seems very motivated to move things forward quickly. But yes, I agree. I think there's a real possibility that this plays out either in the fall or after the election. And that's really going to be determined by when the Supreme Court decision comes out, exactly what it says, how quickly Judge Chutkan can move, how much time she gives Trump's team to prepare for trial after that hearing. So I think that's exactly right. That's what I think we have to look forward to. And I'm sure it's going to be really disappointing to people, although I feel like that was already baked in by the time we had this oral argument.
Yes. And I think that there will also be a question on if they go down that route. I think there's kind of two sub possibilities in, how you figure out whether something's official or private. And the big question there, if they followed that line of the flowchart, is will they look into motive or in the purpose?
Right.
In other words, because this is where the Obama drone strike piece comes in, is are you ordering the drone strike? And by the way, I completely disagreed with that drone strike, but I don't think that he was intentionally trying to murder someone. I think he was ordering a military action against someone who was covered under the authorization. That is something that's done for the national defense, for, policy, for national security as a part of the commander-in-chief, versus there's a journalist, American journalist, who's, living in Jordan, who wrote something mean about me, and I'm going to send a drone to kill him. That would clearly be a personal motivation that I think would be prosecutable. And the question is, if they go down the road of trying to distinguish between official and private acts in the criminal context, are they going to say, well, if you did it as commander-in-chief, then you can't touch it? Or we're going to actually look at and allow for evidence to come in of what drove that decision. And that can make a big difference in what is considered official and what's not.
Yeah, I think it's really great analysis, Asha. I mean, I think the way I would think of this is, from my perspective, I think the potential issues that could come out of this decision are not really going to be Trump related, unless he has a second term and does something. It's not going to be related to this prosecution. It's really about this rule for the ages that Justice Gorsuch talked about. Are we going to create situations where a president has unfettered authority to do things that are highly problematic because of this decision, where they literally will have complete immunity and it'll be above the law as to certain, is a certain subset of activities? I did feel better after hearing Justice Barrett's comments, because it seemed to me like she was signed off, or was willing to sign off on a very narrow view of what a presidential immunity would be. That was my takeaway. I could be wrong. Okay, I'm not a mind reader. That was my takeaway. But I am concerned about it, and I'm more concerned for the future than I am for the present.
Yeah, can we talk about Justice Alito, though? Because he was, I think, maybe the farthest off the deep end. Well, let's just talk about the different justices. I think we heard from Thomas at the beginning. I don't know that we heard from him again after that. Thomas, of course, big question mark why he was even sitting hearing this case, because he's there to adjudicate whether this is official or private, which would potentially make the difference in whether the president has culpability. And his wife participated in the entire facts that are giving rise to this particular dispute. I mean, to me, this is a clear-cut case of recusal. He didn't recuse. And his question was, where is the source of authority where you are finding this absolute immunity? And remember, he's a quote unquote textualist. He believes that you have to find it in the text of the Constitution or it doesn't exist. And obviously there's nothing in the Constitution that says the president has absolute immunity. And Trump's lawyers claimed that it derives from the vestiture clause. This is the first line of Article 2 that says all the executive power shall vest in the president of the United States. The irony here is that the facts of this case is that Trump used the executive authority that's vested in him to prevent power from vesting in the next duly elected president. In other words, he was trying to prevent the Constitution from continuing to be operational in that regard. This is the argument that Justice Luttig makes. And that part makes no sense, because if you're interpreting that kind of immunity to derive from the vestiture clause, and you're basically saying that the Constitution contemplates democratic suicide, basically.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, so Justice Thomas famously says very little during oral argument. He usually says nothing at all. I don't really know whether we could take away anything from that question. I mean, do you think there's any chance whatsoever that he's going to side with, Barrett and Roberts in this one?
I mean, if he's intellectually
he should.
honest, like if he's really a textualist, if he cannot find in the Fourth Amendment a penumbra of privacy, and believes that can't sustain Roe versus Wade, then how is he finding immunity in the vestiture clause of Article 2? I mean, it doesn't make any sense, but I don't think that he has, I don't have faith that he's necessarily going to be intellectually honest or consistent. I'm sorry.
Okay. Well, I'm going to, but that one to me, though, I don't think will learn much in oral argument about it.
Okay. Yeah. So I just want to put
the real focus of the oral argument, right, is the questions from Alito, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh. And Kavanaugh.
So these guys were really questioning so there were kind of two things going on here. One is, what can be a meaningful check? And of course, there was this idea that the institutions will provide the check to a rogue president. Weirdly, at the same time, suggesting that the checks inherent in these institutions, like the criminal justice system, would stop a rogue prosecution. And Alito, a former prosecutor, seemed very cynical about this. And he was kind of asking these sneering questions like, that a prosecutor can go after anybody. And, it was kind of like, I don't know, it was just a very cynical view of the justice system, especially coming from a former prosecutor who is not necessarily pro-defendant or anti-law enforcement in any other context. And meanwhile, back at the ranch, Kavanaugh, of all people, brought up the independent counsel as an example of prosecutions run amok. And
just to create some context here so everyone understands why that's ironic, that he was really the chief lieutenant for Kenneth Starr in the investigation and ultimately the impeachment of President Clinton.
And he just and by the way, he didn't mention that. He's not like, from my own experience, I know that these are runaway prosecutions. He was just like, well, what about that? Like, it was just very innocent. And don't those show that you can, this would open the door. And so you had this, what I think the big takeaway is that they were seeming to suggest, and in fact, I think Alito says this more explicitly, that the greater danger to the stability of democracy are all of the crazy rogue prosecutions that can't be stopped if there is no immunity given to the president, not all of the crazy things that a president could or would be able to do without accountability if he knows that he faces no threat of criminal prosecution.
Right. And I can understand it generated a lot of outrage. I mean, I have a different view of Alito's comments in that I actually, as a former prosecutor, do believe that prosecutors have a very broad authority. We have to oversee it very carefully because otherwise it can be abused, right? And I do think that the system doesn't always rein in prosecutors sufficiently when there's unethical abuses of power by prosecutors. Of course, as you point out, Justice Alito does not seem concerned about that when the defendant's last name isn't Trump. Okay, so I do agree with that point. But I also don't, I think it's going to be one of those dissents that, it is what it is.
Also, though, I mean, it's counterintuitive to me. Because if you have a president who has immunity for official acts, then why not use the Justice Department to go after whoever with rogue prosecutions, to fabricate evidence, to gin up charges? I mean, there's nothing stopping him, including, by the way, for another former president. Like, you can just make up some, like, he murdered somebody, or, some private act that wouldn't... If he really believes that there's no check in the criminal justice system, then it actually makes it worse. It opens the door for him to really go after anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I will say that one thing that just disappointed me, if you ask me what disappointed me the most out of this as a cynical person, okay, you're saying cynical view, as a cynical person, what upset me the most, concerned me the most with this oral argument, is there wasn't, in my view, enough focus in the fact of placing the president formally above the law, right? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, whatever core piece of immunity we're talking about is going to place the president of the United States above the law, something that we really have held as a core tenet of something we do not do. Civil lawsuits, I mean, are one thing, because really there it's essentially about recompensing for injury, okay, is really what I view that. I can understand, and frankly, the bar for filing a civil lawsuit is a lot lower. But for criminal prosecution, I think you have to be very careful about placing anyone formally above the law. So I think it's just an extreme concern. There was not enough concern about it. Am I disappointed about that? Yes, 100%. And I think that people have a right to be upset about that. As somebody calling, to use Robert's, I think, false analogy of balls and strikes, but as somebody in our role calling balls and strikes, I think, like I said, the good news is I don't think that's where we're going to end up, but I think that is something we should all be concerned about.
And, I mean, the most generous thing I could say about that bunch that seemed to be inclined towards some kind of immunity is perhaps a recognition that they would be tipping the scales in favor of Trump, and potentially enabling his presidency, and maybe they're looking out for Joe Biden. It's like, they're like, well, as long as we're going to be making a dictator president, maybe we should throw Biden a bone and give him some immunity from whatever's about to come.
There are people who are legitimately concerned about prosecutions by Trump if he became president again. It might be something we want to discuss in a future episode, his plans to prosecute us all. If he, all of us, anybody who's been critical of him.
I'm on the C list. You're on the D list, I think. But you're on TV more than me, so maybe you're on the B list.
Okay, I don't know about that. No, I'm happy to be on the D or E or F list on that one. But in all seriousness, I do think there may be something to that. So, Asha, we had a criminal trial, the first criminal trial of former president of the United States this past week. And what people discovered, I think, is that while there are definitely some interesting moments and there's insights, it's not as riveting as Law and Order. It's not like there's some confession on the witness stand. It's not like it all wraps up in 47 minutes. Witnesses march in, they say a lot of things, they march out, and there's lots of nuts and bolts that come with the trial.
Yeah, I don't know. I find it very riveting. I mean, and I think this kind of gets to, if this were televised, I do think people would be watching it all day. All day.
100%. As somebody who tries cases for a living, I mean, if there's so many, it's like, man, I wish people could see this. It's like these moments, right, that do happen in courtrooms. This one, I think, yes, everybody in the courtroom, the bailiff would probably become a national celebrity, right? So no, I agree with that. There is a debate about cameras in the courtroom, but I think, there were some interesting moments that happened thus far. I mean, to me, the testimony that was the most interesting was David Pecker's. And, he was the first witness He is, the former publisher of the National Enquirer. And really the way he talked about his relationship with Trump is interesting. I mean, really an arm of the Trump machine, the eyes and ears for Trump out there, which is interesting. And it wasn't just Trump the candidate, but Trump the president. I mean, the imagery of him going into the Oval Office, having these meetings and conversations with Trump asking him how Karen McDougal is doing and what she's up to and how she's feeling and what she's saying. I mean, that was interesting. Sarah Huckabee Sanders being involved in this scheme as, while she is working as a public official was very interesting. I mean, a lot of detail that was interesting and salacious, but I think some of the more important points are how Trump was characterized by the prosecution. I mean, for me as a tactician, somebody who's tried a lot of cases, seeing how they're focusing on him being detail-oriented, somebody in the weeds, focusing on, him as a micromanager, I think is super important. Packer talking about how this was all about the election and not about embarrassment or press coverage. That was very interesting as well.
Yeah, I think that was what I thought was really achieved with Pecker is, number one, he has a lot of credibility. I mean, I think, if anything, he has every reason to, not help the prosecution. And I think the biggest weakness one of the biggest weaknesses that the prosecution had to address is if he's talking about this being something they did all the time, and they had been doing it going back to when Trump, to burnish his whole reputation, I think to tie it to election interference was going to be the tough thing, right? Because it could I think there's an argument there that, look, this was just business as usual. And yes, it coincided with the time he was running for president, but it wasn't for the campaign. And I thought what he presented, not only about the timing of when these specific allegations were caught and killed, but also the fact that he was running negative stories about Trump's opponents. I thought that was a really important piece of evidence because it did, to me, show that there was a specific focus on boosting Trump's candidacy. And then you have to think about those catch and kill stories and the timing against that context.
Yeah, very important point. By the way, if you're not watching on YouTube, Pancake the cat, it made a guest appearance, and is the reason if her voice went in and out, it was because of Mr. Pancake. But putting that to the side for a minute, yeah, I think that's right. And one thing that people I think don't always focus on is how you actually, as a trial lawyer, spend all this time on these little points. So you almost, you try to build all these little pieces throughout a trial so that the jury feels like they're putting a puzzle together. And they all kind of line up with, like, if you're a prosecutor in this case, all these little points add up to the guy is a criminal. Okay, he's guilty or whatever. But you're trying to put all these nuggets out there so the people who are the note takers in the jury, who are like, ooh, they think like they're solving some crime.
Yeah, they're like Columbo.
Yeah, they're little Columbos, and they're like, oh, there's a nugget. That's part of the catch and kill scheme, and it's all like just. I mean, 2/3 of the jury's not paying attention. They're thinking about like the Knicks game or whatever, and like, okay, how, are we gonna get past the Celtics this year or whatever? But the people who are paying attention are very riveted by that stuff, and you can see the seeds of that. That the prosecution's sowing here. So I've seen a variety of commentary. I was on TV yesterday with some defense attorney who was like blasting the prosecution's case. I feel like it's going about what I would expect thus far. I mean, the prosecution should be up there. It's the middle of their case. The defense hasn't done anything yet. And they put on their own witnesses, and it's unsurprising. You should not surprise anyone that the prosecution witnesses are saying things that the prosecution thinks are helpful to their case.
So let me ask you a question. In just a little bit of a throwback to our earlier segment, which is, if there were to be some sort of immunity for official acts, I mean, there was a big chunk of evidence that came in with Sarah Huckabee Sanders and calls that were made, while in the Oval Office with his officials. And, and in fact, a lot of this conduct takes place after he takes office, including some of the payments of the checks. And I'm just curious, depending on how broadly an immunity would be defined, could that impact later any conviction in Manhattan if it turned out that these kinds of covered, if any of these acts would be quote unquote potentially covered and introduced as evidence that were material to his guilt?
Could it? Yes, 100%. Do I believe that Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Barrett, whoever writes that opinion, will craft a rule that would cover this? I don't think that's going to be the case, but I think there's a 100% chance that Trump will file a motion claiming that whatever opinion comes out of the Supreme Court does cover this. He already has made that argument previously, pre-trial. So I think he's going to argue that no matter what. I will say this is another example why elections matter so much. I mean, aside from electing Trump, you're also getting people on the Supreme Court who ultimately are considering whether making, hush money payments to porn stars and creating false business records in New York are official acts, right? That's.
I just wanted to raise that because, we are talking about something that largely occurred before he took office. And then, the Mar-a-Lago is something that largely occurred after he left. But I do think that there are potential immunity-based arguments that can impact all of these cases depending on what happens. To go back to the evidence, though, it does sound like the other vulnerability that has yet to be addressed, and it sounds like they did a little bit, what you were saying, that Trump was in the weeds, that he knew the details, but really getting to his knowledge of the falsification of the records themselves, which was really happening. So Cohen would present these sham invoices, and then these would be recorded in the Trump Revocable Trust. I actually have like a diagram that I have to draw out.
Is this one of your famous drawings, Asha?
It is one of my famous drawings. So Cohen presents a sham invoice to the Trump Organization. The invoice is recorded in the Trump Revocable Trust. That is the first part of the falsification. And then the second is that when he's paid from the Trump Revocable Trust, that payment is recorded in the detail general ledger of the Trump Organization. And I mean, is Trump really recording those? Or I mean, I think it seems like what do you think is what would the prosecutors have to show to kind of really establish that he understood that, kind of those bookkeeping details, that he understood exactly what was happening?
So it's a great question. I mean, what they're going to put in for sure, right, is the testimony of Michael Cohen, who's going to say that, I presume. Mm-hmm. Okay. I assume that Michael Cohen's going to say that. If not, then it's all a lot of inference, right? So, I mean, they could say, of course, Trump knew. Trump was this micromanager and Trump, was really running things and that sort of thing. I mean, there probably will be some evidence along those lines, like evidence that they'll put in showing that Trump actually, while he was in the White House, was still paying close attention to the finances of the Trump Organization and so on. They are going to show, obviously, that he signed checks, that sort of thing. I wonder, I mean, in the opening statement, they really did not promise a lot along those lines, Asha. And I think that is what this comes down to. When I tried to identify it when we talked about it previously, that's what this case comes down to ultimately. If the jury's paying attention to what matters legally, that is going to be what the case comes down to. If you're arguing inferences, what I mean by inferences are, we don't have direct evidence, so you kind of have to logic your way to that from the fact that, he was a micromanager and he got this sheet of paper, that sheet of paper, and you can put two and two together. That's much harder than, hey, we've got a few people from the Trump Organization saying they discussed it with him, right? That's just so much more direct. I have to think that the evidence there is a little lighter than the prosecution would like it to be, because we didn't get some big announcement in the opening statement that you're going to hear from a witness who's going to tell you ABC
right
about that conversation.
Yeah. And that is the part that has yet to come. So it sounds like they're opening with kind of the underlying crime that they don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt, but that's the scheme that's there that was intended to be concealed. But then they have to go to the actual falsification that was being done to conceal it.
That's right. And that's what this case, from a legal perspective, is going to come down to. Jurors decide whatever they're going to decide. But that's really, I think, where everything's going to turn. And that'll really matter. I mean, there's a lot of sideshow right now, not only with, like you said, background witnesses, but also, of course, this whole gag order thing, which we've discussed at length. We're not going to rehash all of that here, but these $1,000 fines and civil contempt and whatever. But at the end of the day, that's what the conviction is going to come down to, what we just discussed.
Okay, well, look forward to Bragg calling his next witness. So, oh my God, my cat is biting. Okay, hold on.
Well, speaking of your cat, Asha, before we go, we've had a pet going through here. Have you considered taking your cat outside and shooting him in the head?
No.
I know. Could you believe that?
No, not his little head. No.
Things. Yeah, in my house, we rescue puppies. We do not kill them, like murder them. That was one of the most
my
bizarre
cat literally
things.
has his claw in one of my favorite sweaters right now. Stop it. And is trying to bite me, but I still...
I'm not going
to murder my cat. What is wrong with people?
I mean, it blows my mind.
No pun intended.
Oh my God. Oh, please. I'm just saying, like, for me, I have to say, when I said, like, who shoots their puppy, that blew my mind, because the way it was described was not like the dog was attacking my child and wouldn't give up and I had to save my kid's life. It was like this dog was a bad hunting dog and was going after the neighbor's chickens. So instead of like even bringing him to the shelter or something, I'm literally going to take him into a gravel pit, shoot him. And he didn't go down at first. So I shoot him again. And then my kids are like, hey, where's the dog? Where's our little puppy? Yeah, Cricket. Where's Cricket? Well, I shot him in the head. I mean, what, seriously? Like, it was bizarre.
Yeah, that's when you have really failed to read the room. Because, by the way, we're talking about South Dakota Governor Kristi Noem, for anyone who's been under a rock.
You've been under a rock?
And hasn't heard this pet scandal, which is that in her autobiography, she details how she murdered her dog, her 14-month-old puppy, Cricket, and a goat. And it's not really clear why she shot the goat.
Here's the thing. Okay, I think the goat, I'm not 100% sure about the goat. People do eat goat or whatever. I'm going to put that to the side.
I don't think she ate it.
Okay, I don't know.
That was the one that she had to go back for a second time because she didn't.
Oh, is that the one she went back to for a second time?
Yeah,
okay.
I think the dog she shot in the face.
Oh my God. Okay,
I know it's really.
Everyone knows I have a puppy.
I know.
Very much.
It's really upsetting. Like when animal and child abuse really get me upset. Like I can't listen to it or like anything that even gets close to it. I can't like deal. Like there's like a Netflix series right now about like a guy who I think was torturing cats online, and like there were detectives, like online detectives who went and found him. And I love true crime stuff, but I can't watch that. It's like because I can't unsee it or I can't stop thinking about it after. She wrote about this voluntarily in her autobiography as something that she was proud of. And
she's tweeting through it too.
Oh my God. And like, I think the craziest part is it feels like in 8 years, it's like the first thing that's really brought the country together left and right, because MAGA is not happy with her either. I mean, you have a lot of people who claimed that they also grew up in rural areas and on farms and ranches, and that this is because she was her tweeting through it as sort of like, you all don't know this kind of lifestyle, and this, sometimes this just has to be done. Yeah, it has to be done when you have like an old animal that is in pain or suffering, and you have to put it down, maybe. Not a puppy. It does.
Even then, not in this fashion. I don't know. Shooting him in the face, and it's not like there's a danger to understand. Like I can understand if the dog was attacking someone, like you were afraid for someone's life. Okay. This is like purely leading the dog. The dog trusts you. You're leading the dog
to a gravel pit.
To a gravel pit so you can murder
like
him.
A mob boss.
Yeah, it's very cold-hearted and bizarre. I mean, to give you a sense for myself, like if my teenage stepdaughter wants to take the dog anywhere, I'm like, I'll make sure she knows, like, nothing better happen to this little doggy. The idea that something would happen to my dog that I didn't cause myself is just like, you could take the stepdaughter with the dog, like my little doggy, like you cannot do anything, little Henry. I mean, he's the prince of this household. We cannot do anything.
So there's this thing called the McDonald triad, which is supposedly like things that people exhibit mainly in childhood that predict whether they will become a serial killer. One of them is abusing and torturing and killing animals. The second is setting fires, like, setting random fires to things. And then the third is chronic bedwetting. And it's like having them all together. I'm just putting that out there. The other thing that I'll just mention is that it was claimed that she put this in to show her toughness as a way to impress Trump in some bid to be VP. And so maybe I'll just add my controversial take, Renato, to take the heat off of you. I think that there is this really surprising aspect of Trump. He lacks empathy in so many ways, but I think that there are these little bits where he shows some surprising humanity just for like brief moments. So I remember reading that he was very upset about Don Jr.'s like killing of the hunting. Like he was not into that. So that's like data point one. Data point two, you'll remember when Assad deployed chemical weapons in Syria and the King of Jordan came, and there were all those like horrific pictures of children that were suffering and who had been poisoned. And apparently the King of Jordan had met with Trump and shown him photographs of these children. And then Trump came out and was like, the red line has been crossed. And, and so I think in the abstract, like he is generally like not empathetic. I do think that in kind of graphic, visceral presentations, and maybe this is because I think in his psychology, he always needs to show his power against people he perceives to be a threat. And like innocent animals and children are not threats to him. And so maybe he's able, like his ego is not as fortified in those contexts. Anyway, I'm just saying, I think that if she thought that particular thing would impress Trump, I don't even think that would impress Trump, is my point.
Yeah, I don't think it'll impress Trump. I mean, I wonder if she's compensating she's a woman and maybe she's thinking she has to appear very strong or very aggressive because of some stereotype. And that's that's the most charitable thing I could say here. I heard some journalists saying that Trump is not a big dog fan, but I would have to think somebody in this camp would realize she's no longer the best VP pick since she's murdering little puppies. It's bizarre. Like I said, dogs and pets in general are something that does bring us all together. Who doesn't love their dog or in your case, cat? I don't know. That's very bizarre.
Well, rest in peace, Cricket.
MSW Media.